Hello and welcome. I think it's episode 13 of Get It. So, first of all, welcome to my guest, David Barrow. I met David, was probably 3 years ago in Amsterdam, just after the launch of Verisum, where I had the pleasure of his company in my classroom for a few days. And we just clicked. Yeah, and so afterward, we stayed in touch. And one of the nice things for me about David is his ability to connect with people. Um, and I think today's topic is a very opt topic because I think it's something that you actually got right. Yeah, co-creating value and engaging people in projects. So, hello and welcome, David Barrow.
Oh, thank you, Johan. I think you're the first person whose training course I've sat on that's described us as connecting and getting on. Not because I don't connect and get on with people, but I also tend to challenge them a little bit on those courses. But on that particular course, I found it utterly enlightening, and that's why I was probably sat with my jaw slightly open for most of the days, just listening and hanging on to what you were saying, because I genuinely found it really interesting and informative.
Thanks for the compliment, bro. Really appreciate that. Yeah, so I mean, subsequently, we were on webinars and stuff together, and some of the experiences that you've shared about the projects that you're doing and the way that you engage with customers, and especially difficult customers, for me was something that I really looked up to. Maybe I'm not that good at dealing with difficult people, but you certainly seem to have the knack to do that. So, David, this issue of value, and especially the value of IT services, there's a long-standing debate, I suppose, about the value of IT services and how you measure IT services, and if you can at all actually measure the value of what IT is doing. And you've got a unique view on that, and part of that is that you've just completed a publication for Axelos that is a complementary publication, if I'm correct. Yes.
That's right. Yes.
That specifically talks about co-creating value. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's co-creating value in organisations, and it's a guide for consultants, executives, and managers. But I guess to come back to your point
Can I
about
quickly interject? I think there's a problem with your mic. Just make sure it's plugged in properly.
Oh, sorry, just a moment.
It's going all whizzy on us, and it was perfect before we started. So,
is that any better now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so go for it.
Yeah. So sorry about that. We got two IT people here, and one of them can't work a microphone, so that's a bit of a worry. So the book is titled "Co-creating Value in Organizations Using ITIL 4." It definitely leans upon ITIL 4, but it also talks about my work over what I've only recently realised is getting on for 30 years working in the industry at various levels. And when you were just a moment ago talking about dealing with difficult customers, I was thinking about that when I was writing the book, and also in response to your question. And I owe all of that to working on service desks when I was a youngster, because there was never a customer that called me on that service desk to ask me how I was, how my day was going, if I was happy with any particular sports result, or if I watched TV the previous evening. They had an issue. They had something they needed me to solve, and I couldn't always solve it. But my aim with all of those calls was to leave them feeling better when they left it than it was when they arrived. And so I developed a tact for dealing with people over two to 3 minutes, and we'll talk about measures later, because that's where that started to sort of digest for me, the measures. And I've carried that through, I think, at least my career, and the book leans upon that. It talks about those earlier experiences to a point, but that is definitely where I felt like I could co-create something with that person on that call. And the thing I was looking to co-create is that they'd feel like they could trust that their issue, their incident, was being managed and handled once they left the phone call, because I couldn't always solve it. And everything's come from there. So the publication goes into more detail, goes into a larger sphere, but that's where it all comes from.
Yeah. So I was, I suppose, one of the few who was privileged to actually read through it before it will come out. And I quite like the fact that, there's all of these personal anecdotes also and examples in the book that makes it just so much more relatable. Yeah. And maybe, especially people coming from an IT context is not always the best communicators. Yeah. So in the book you've got a concept called allo, which I found an interesting concept. You want to elaborate a little bit around it, and where does it come from, and how do you use it?
Wow. So, I mean, everything comes from those that I've been dealing with, those that I've learned from. So it certainly wasn't in me when I started working in IT. But it's fairly simple, or at least it sounds simple. It's asking, it's listening, it's observing, and it's empathizing. So if I boil it down to the previous scenario with the service desk, when somebody called me, I would ask them what the issue is, and they would often give me their interpretation of that. And if you look back in all of the old IT kind of animated jokes, it's my cup holder isn't working, back in the days of CD-ROM. But they weren't far wrong in terms of some of the phone calls I would get. So by asking somebody what they were doing that they could no longer do, by listening to their answer and observing tension in their voice or observing angst or urgency, I was then able to empathize with their situation and manage my tone accordingly. And so the way I like to talk about, sort of look through allo, is understanding that customers, consumers, users of services have their own definition of value when it comes to that service, and it might be based on a business pattern. For example, a really obvious one is HR services not working during payroll. Not only does that impact them, it impacts the whole organization, but they will be the person that's getting it in the ear for it not working. So allo is just simply about getting an insight into what's happening in that particular situation or series of situations, and understanding where you can make a difference, a positive difference. And that can simply be through the act of listening. And I think that's kind of prevalent in life, let alone in what we do from a career perspective.
Yeah. I can remember my grandmother used to say to me, my child, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, use it in that proportion. And I think that's correct. Yeah. I can remember about 15 or so years ago, there was a large organization that asked us to come and do a Microsoft operations assessment when that was still a thing. And about half a day into the sessions, I went to the IT manager and said to him, "But why do you want me to do this? Because there's nothing wrong in your environment." He says, "No, but you don't understand. I mean, the CEO says he's going to outsource all IT because everybody is upset." And that's exactly what we did. We walked the floors, we listened to interactions, we asked customers questions, and eventually we realized that it was really about expectations and communication. And it took us about 2 weeks, and all of a sudden all the metrics was positive. without changing anything technically. Yeah.
Yeah.
And quite often this miscommunication was with good intent. Somebody would walk past somebody and they would say, "Can you quickly help me?" And says, "So I'm just quickly on my way to Barry, and when I'm done there, I'll come and see what." And then they forget. Yeah.
Yes.
So simple stuff, and really understanding that IT services is actually not about tech; it's about the people who consume them, and
Absolutely.
the need for their consumption is to do something, to create something, and that's the real value in the business.
Yeah.
So I
Absolutely.
really like that. Yeah. So
And I
that's
think
sort of,
we've.
go for it.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and I think, since I started the book, which was kind of mid-COVID, I talk about it a little in there, but I've thought about it more since writing, and that's, I think, one of the issues we see now in the workplace, where we're only communicating through this medium. We're losing that human connection now, because we're only meeting between 3 and 4, between 2 and 3, to discuss issues, to discuss an initiative, to discuss. We're not actually communicating more generically, and I think Allo is something that we need to do more of, especially today, because we don't have that connection.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful but simple concept. Yeah, so I like simple. I'm a
Yeah,
simpler.
me too.
I don't like complicated. Yeah.
No, well, I mean, I personally, I'm not an academic. I don't come. I left school literally the moment I could and went into the workplace. So I don't consider myself what you would term as intellectual, and that's why I like simple things, because they're easy to understand. You can form your own opinion and work with them, and something like Allo is just. I think it applied to all walks of life, through all scenarios, and I just happened to lift it for the publication.
Okay, so is the concept your concept, or did you hear it somewhere? Or?
Oh no, I heard it somewhere. I can't recall where. I'm sure it's definitely from somebody cleverer than I. It may have possibly come from my time at IBM,
Okay.
or I may have read about it. But it's I definitely recall being able to put the acronym to the behaviour much later than I was exhibiting the behaviour.
Yeah, yeah. So the book is about, first of all, different groups of people doing something, and that something is to create value. So I suppose the first question should be, what is value?
Well, I was hoping you'd ask that question, because value is something that I think is different for all of us. So if you and I've got it to my left here, so I'm not going to pretend that I've come up with this definition. But if you just go and Google definition of value, you'll get different definitions, because everybody's idea of value is different. But one of those is principle or standards of behaviour, one's judgment of what's important in life. So there is no definition there, so to speak. It's based on the individual. It's also based on the scenario. It's based on the time, the place, the priority. And so my definition of value is something that you feel and can communicate and share if it's more than one of you at that particular time. And then it's about understanding how that value carries through the life of the particular subject that you're talking about. In our case, that's services in IT, digital services. So that's when you then have to look at the life cycle of a service, but ultimately, what value does that service add to the consumers of the service and those that need to act as the users, the people that interact with it on a daily basis? And it's a very difficult thing to pin down.
Yeah, and
But
that's
it
why
comes from
co-creation is
conversation.
important.
Exactly. Yes.
Because unless the IT service is used, or any service for that matter, by a consumer, they use the service normally to create something, either another service or a good. Yeah, I don't know. Do you say a good? Because I'm still from the school that believes that products comprises of services and goods.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think one of the things I knew somewhere is that every product is a service.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it is. Everything we use is part of a service.
Yeah. Yeah, and some products has got service aspects and other services has got product attributes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the point is that unless the service that we provide is utilized, value cannot be created. Now, I think for far too long, IT has tried to create that service on their own. So, is that sort of what you're trying to get across in this whole, conversation about co-creating value, a closer relationship between the consumer and the provider or the creator of the service?
Exactly. Yes. So I have worked in my career in outsourcing. That's where the majority of my career was spent, and definitely my formative years. And I worked in IBM, so a company that does many things very, very well. One of which is outsourcing. And I worked at the time with no real idea what the word enterprise meant on enterprise service management processes. But I honestly didn't know what enterprise meant. It only dawned on me again when I was putting this together that I thought, how did I do that back then? Because I just thought it was something out of Starship, from Star Trek. And I guess to answer your question, what I realized as my experience grew, as my understanding grew, as my own personal values developed, and the co-creation of value is very key there, is personal values. I realized that working in that environment didn't fit me anymore because the value we were creating was mainly from a commercial construct, as opposed to delivering. So it's slightly financial, a bit of reporting in there, but what there wasn't always was consumer end user value. It was framed around service levels, and so that's where I'm trying to come from in this publication is putting all of that together to say that definitely counts. Organizational value counts, partner value counts, people values count. But the way to really co-create those and other values is to bring them together. And I think the title is correct around co-creating value, but underlying all of that is knowledge. And that comes back to Allo, comes back to that observing and empathizing. That if we share knowledge, if we agree on how we sustain knowledge, we can continue to co-create value. But without knowledge, we actually only create it for a point in time.
Yeah. Okay. So during this last bit of feedback from you, you mentioned the issue of an SLA, and personally, I think 99% of IT SLAs is not worth the paper they're written on.
Not 99.9.
Yeah. So, because the question is, does it matter? Yeah, does it matter whether you do 99.99% availability, or does it matter? I suppose it matters that you close a call, within 8 hours. But what about that call that actually you should have closed in 3 minutes?
Yeah.
And that was not in the SLA. So tell me a little bit about your experience in terms of the use in SLAs, especially in outsourced contracts, and then some of the alternatives that's been mentioned, things like experience level agreements and so forth, and maybe add to that. Aren't they too fluffy?
They They are. I think they're either too fluffy or too prescriptive in an odd way. And I'll give you the prescriptive first, because that's where my thoughts started around this. And it goes back to the service desk. So my average call time, as well as my average answer time and so on, and my average call time was supposed to be 2 minutes. Now, what was I able to do in 2 minutes that added any value to the person calling? If I couldn't solve it immediately, and that's after I've confirmed who they are, their date of birth, the third line of their third letter of their password, etc., etc. But there you go. I'm a minute and a half at least, and that's if I'm rushing it, and if I'm therefore making the call an uncomfortable experience for them in doing so. What can I achieve in the rest of that 30 seconds? And I just said to myself,
I'm on a small screen. Sorry.
No problem. I just said to myself, blow that I'm not. That's not going to help me help them. So that was far too prescriptive. It didn't give me and my colleagues on the service desk the opportunity to offer service. We actually went through a rebranding exercise from help desk to service desk, and we were doing neither. So that's when it first started dawning me many years ago. This isn't valuable. Unless I can solve it immediately, it's not valuable. And even the resolutions, they were only going to result in another incident coming in another short period of time. They weren't really resolutions. So as I went through my career and started kind of managing teams and looking after outsources and doing customer reporting and sitting down in front of customers, and doing that whole, well, we're green, we've been available for 99.9% of the time, 99.97, whatever was in the commercial agreement. And you'd see almost the lack of emotion on their face, or the anger. It was never happy. I don't think I ever had a customer go, oh, brilliant, cheers. It was either, whatever, I'm resigned to it, or no, I'm not happy with that. And it's because that 0.3% where it went down was during the busiest part of their business day, or during a month end, or during it's of value to them. And so we didn't, in those, and that's where it dawned on me, this isn't how I want to work. So my first engagement outside of outsourcing, when I was a one-man band and kind of venturing out, I looked at a team who were part of a security function, and nobody had any real idea quite what value they added. They've invested heavily in this team through a mixture of technology, people, and expertise. But they've not seen any output that said they were getting anything back. And what this team were reporting was actually being misrepresented, because there was that whole sort of set of people between the actual team and the generation of the report, then somebody looking through it, making it pretty, then handing it or printing it on a piece of paper.
Dave, your mic is acting up again.
Oh no. I've got two. Hopefully that's better again.
No, it's still fuzzy. No, don't know. Let's try. Talk again. Now there's nothing. Okay, you're completely dead, mate.
Is that better?
Yeah, and it's important what you're saying. I don't want people not to hear it.
No. Is that better now?
Yeah, now I can hear you again. Yeah. So this broken telephone, that sits between the people reporting and the consumer of the report. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And the consumer of the report was ultimately the person that wrote the checks for the team. So they're thinking, where's the value in this? Now, what that report was saying, seemingly to them, was that the number of security-related incidents had gone up. That it was around 90% higher than it had previously been. And when I looked at it as somebody that had done a lot of reporting and managed reporting and presented to customers, it took me to go and speak to the team and ask a really simple question. Is this saying that you're getting 90% more security incidents, or is it saying you're detecting and remediating 90% more security incidents before they become an incident.
Yeah.
And the team said, well, it's that, obviously. It's like, well, nobody else knows this. And just through sharing that little bit of information, reframed the whole element of them providing a service. And
so now the perception of value is there, because this is something that that's negative that I'm not getting. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Then we can see financial value in it because we've spent money on it. We can see real value because our security profile means we're better covered. We understand more. We're getting less real incidents. I should have called those events actually, as opposed to incidents. And now we can have some trust in that team, and also that team, if I'm being blunt, felt that they could have some trust in somebody now to go and actually share their information and not misrepresent it. Because they lacked the confidence as a result of that to do so themselves, but then we could build on that confidence.
Yeah. Okay. So before we continue to talk now about SLAs and XLAs, let's talk about reporting then. So how do you report for value? Because most of the IT reports are just BS.
Yeah. But if we talk about value at a point of time, they are deemed as valuable at the point in time where you agree how you're going to monitor a supplier, for example, or you're going to monitor a team and their performance. So people sit down and they say, what do we need to know to understand if you're doing a good job? And they do that normally day minus 100 or day minus 180. And then by the time that they start to receive those reports, they're BS for a few reasons. One is that generally they're kind of reporting on the previous month. And that month is now, it's a good 45 days old from the beginning of that month, because you're not reporting until the middle of the next month. You've spent an awful lot of time trying to gather that information when, to be honest, you could have just automated it if you have optimized it first. And also it's irrelevant. And there's too much. It's history. There's too much of it. It's not relevant, but we all do it anyway because that's what it says in the contract. Now, how you make that more relevant is you have to have a fairly difficult conversation at first and say, is this of value to you? Are you getting from it what you would like? Is it helping you run your business? Is it helping you deliver value to your customers and your consumers through an understanding of the profile of your service today? And once you frame it that way, you can actually, coming back to that, the likes of lean, you can just shed a lot of waste. You can get teams more focused on delivering reporting that is of value and is current. And you can then, once it's optimized, you can even stick it on a dashboard. And in one scenario, we just had it on an iPad for the particular executive, when previously the poor person's PA had been printing a 60-page document at 7:30 a.m. in the morning, so it was ready for 9 a.m. for their meeting for something that was 45 days old. But it just carried on. It persisted.
Yeah. So much of this bad behavior is actually locked up in SLAs, number one. And number two, I'm going to say this, and I know people will blame me for saying this, in the bad practice that's described in best practice. Because we write SLAs because it's in the book.
Yes.
And we write it this way because it's in the book. So what is your response to that?
My response about 6 or 7 years ago would be, it's in the book, so surely we've got to do it that way. And I said earlier about IBM doing many things brilliantly. One of the things they do well for themselves is that whole process piece is very structured. The SLAs are very structured. And for me, I think there's always been that kind of that misunderstanding that something like ITIL, for example, is a set way of doing things, and it was never designed to be that way. It was designed to be, it's used in Verisum, guardrail. So it's a guardrail. It's something you operate within. But the analogy I like to give when I work with my customers and I'm going in for the first time, especially if they're looking to set up ITSM under whichever framework they want to use, is, and hopefully this analogy isn't lost on the audience because it's a particular type of analogy on a particular sport. But if you are a football or soccer manager, depending on where you're coming from, and you go into a job and the team's been leaking goals, the first thing you do is sort out the defense. If you can stop leaking goals, you've just increased your chances of winning. And the way people apply IT service management is very similar. They, certainly in my experience, they look to apply it so they stop leaking, so that they don't miss out, they don't get approached by the regulator or the standards agency, whoever it may be, and they come to like the hardest point of regulation, and that's where their processes operate. All that ends up doing, and it may work at first, but all it ends up doing is it disables innovation, it disables agility, and ultimately it disables value. It adds a layer of value for a particular area, but it reduces it elsewhere.
Yeah, I use the analogy of a Band-Aid. I don't know. Do you also have the brand Band-Aid in the UK? So ITSM, to a large extent, or the way that people apply it, is adding Band-Aids instead of sitting back and say, "Why the hell am I cutting myself all the time?"
Yeah.
So I think the only people who gets value out of you using Band-Aids is Johnson and Johnson.
Yes, so true. It's so true.
I've very seldomly met a customer that says, "Ooh, I'm so excited about implementing processes." It's normally consultants who's really excited about doing that. But the poor people that they inflicted on, I'm not so sure. Okay, so if we report then, what do we report on? Because surely that needs to go into the SLA.
Yes, yeah. And I think the thing that we miss out on reporting on, if we're getting to that subject, is the experience. The experience of actually working with and using that service. I was speaking with a customer recently who they operate a contact center, a global contact center. So they have a dependency on a number of services provided to them from their own internal supplier. Now, nobody asks them how that is working for them in providing that service to their consumer. They only get told that it's operating within the parameters of its service level. That doesn't help them at 3 a.m. when, for example, there's a maintenance window happening that they've not been informed about, they're unaware of, they weren't consulted about, and a customer calls in and the service isn't working.
Yeah.
Measuring the experience is so much more than saying, would you recommend this to somebody else? It's about saying, does it work for you when you need it to work for you? And how would you rate that? And it's just, I think it comes back to something you said earlier. We as IT have tried to define the value of services to the business without actually, and it's getting better, but without consulting the business on what they need the value to be from the service.
Yeah. Or how they'll measure it. What is their metric?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Go
for it.
Oh, sorry, I was just simply going to say the way I like to approach the conversation for anybody who's interested how you kick that off is I capture a value statement from the customer of the service. So it might be based on today, as in where are we now? Where would you like it to be? What would show you we're moving in the right direction? Or if it's a new service, what do you want this service to do for you? What would the value statement be of that service provision? And that then helps solidify the requirement. Because when you ask somebody that question, there's very many types of answer, but when you try and push them on a value statement, what will be valuable to you in using this? It can be really interesting what they come up with.
Yeah. Sorry, if you hear a scratch, it's my 13-year-old English pointer that doesn't understand why Daddy don't want to open the door.
Well,
she's supposed to actually be in the house, but clearly she slipped out somewhere because my office is not in the house. Okay, so you sort of slipped a little sentence in between. It's not asking people if they'll recommend you. So, what is your view of the Net Promoter Score? Because I assume that's what you were referring to.
Yes, yeah. So I first came across it, the Net Promoter Score, and so fairly recently, in fairness, 6 years ago when I was working for a cloud provider. They were asking that question to enterprise customers. So the question works depending on the customer. I believe that's my belief. So if you're working with an individual like you and I walking in and out of an airport where the equivalent of the NPS is the happy smiley face, that works. If you're working with an SME who wants to potentially recommend your services to another SME, that works. If you're working for an enterprise, with an enterprise, you need more than that. It can't just be how would you recommend this to somebody else, because they're probably not in the business of doing that. So it's how does it enable you to create value for your customers? How does it enable you to service your customers? There are I should actually have the publication open in front of me, but I don't. But there are a couple of examples that I've put in there. But then like we were saying about ITIL, the publication isn't exhaustive. What's in there is only potentially good for when I wrote it. It could be something that you want to change. But I think it's about understanding when you write that NPS, if that's what you call it, or have that question, agreeing with the customer at that piece of the service life cycle. So new service, established service, retiring service, if you want to break it into that, what's important to them, and asking the question and framing it to that, as opposed to it being the same question from day one to the end.
So I'm being facetious when I ask that question because personally, I think it's a feel-good metric. It's wonderful if it's positive, but if it's negative, you don't know what to do.
Yeah,
it doesn't give you an answer. Yeah, and surely metrics needs to be able to help you to act. Yeah, and to do something. Now, I can understand why a lot of metrics potentially are in service level agreements, although I don't think they should be there. They should actually be in the IT side. Let's use the ITIL term OLA. I don't like doing that because it's still a service level agreement. Yeah, but it's an internal service level agreement. So I can understand why you want to measure availability there. But does it matter to the customer?
No. I mean, it matters to the customer from the perspective of they just want to see that service is up, running, working, delivering what they need, and it's the equivalent of the swan guiding over the lake. They don't care about the legs underneath and how those cogs are working together, which is the OLA. They just need it to work when they need it, how they want it, and at the speed or the priority they need to use it. The stuff that sits behind that in the digital organization, I think OLAs are, again, I guess, partly useful as a metric, but they don't really measure how teams work together. They just measure handoffs. But the handoff that I think is it's a useful thing to know when you're sort of looking at tickets bouncing and so on. But coming back to what you said earlier, you need to be able to know what to do about that. If you're just going to measure tickets bouncing, well, brilliant.
So
just keep measuring tickets bouncing. So what you need to do is facilitate a way to bring teams together outside of that bouncing thing, where they're not thrown in together, where they're not under some pressure as a result of some bounce, and ask them, how could we have done that better?
Yeah.
With the point being how could your management teams, your execs have enabled you to have done that better? How could the tools that we give you have enabled you to have done that better? How can the knowledge that you hold, the organization holds, have enabled you to do those things better? And again, once you, in my mind, lift people away from the event and into the premise of that event and what they could have done better, it's a different viewpoint. And the measure should enable you to do that, not just be a measure for measurement's sake.
Yeah. So quickly talk to me about XLAs, experience level agreements. I can understand that the concept is attractive because perceptions are real. But if you measure those perceptions, which quite often are not really subjective because it's context bound, what's the value of that? And is it a good idea to build a business relationship? So, say for instance, you're an outsourcer, based on something that is so subjective and fluffy.
I think it depends on how you, because everything has to have a label for a start. So that's the label, XLA or experience level agreement. But it's then how you define the experience, and it comes back to that co-creation of value. So in your experience, as in the customer's experience, what would be valuable within this service? If you're measuring that, and as you say, taking action when it doesn't meet that, then that's a true measure of experience and a way to take action to improve, maintain, or continually improve that. That's another key there. But just having that measure in place at a point of time and never changing it, I think I'm at risk of repeating myself, is troublesome, because it doesn't mean it's useful throughout the longevity, the life of a service. So I think for me as a consultant, it's a great phrase to use to change people's thinking from service level to customer focused measurements. But and that's how I use it. But it runs the risk of just becoming a nuller measure that is there for measurement's sake if it's not applied correctly.
So if I say when you define this, it should be done, I suppose, on a basis that says, I can because you. And then if something went wrong, to say, I could not because you.
Yes. Yeah.
Because then it's actionable. So then it's just that, how do you feel about the service that you provide? I can't remember who said it. I think it's one of the guys from the quality movement, most probably Duran or Deming, or may even be Peter Drucker. But he said, I don't know what the definition of quality is, but if I see it, I recognize it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I did some work as part of a team with HSBC a couple of years ago, and inspired by everything, by the way. So I had at that point, I just failed that Verisum, the foundation exam that I failed, when I thought, oh, I'll just go and pass this. I've got all these years of experience. That won't be a problem. Little did I know. And that's what made me think, oh, this is interesting, because this is a different way of thinking to that which I'm used to. It was then when working with that particular customer that I kind of naively proposed that we use a Verisum approach to solve their issues, which is what we ended up doing, and the team agreed, and luckily for me, the sponsor agreed, and I look back and think I hadn't even passed the flipping exam then. I did it the next week just to make sure that I had.
But what you did worked, though.
Yes. So what we did was we put together, and you reminded me of it from what you just said. We put together a community that was focused on quality. And the first question was, what is quality? How do we define quality? And the community agreed that depending on the service, on the outcome of that service in terms of the value it adds, quality was different. But ultimately, quality was defined by, are our customers and consumers happy with that service? And how do we measure their happiness? And that's where we used conceptual XLAs. But we came together, met very regularly, and reviewed service elements from the frame or framed as quality or lack of quality, and we solved those issues, but we also sought to apply them wherever we could across the organization. So we took them as proof of concepts and tested out our theory where it was safe to do so. We were lucky we had trust to do that, and that comes from senior people in that business being innovative in the way of thinking, trusting us, but we had to earn that trust. And through using those proof of concepts, that the service quality function still exists there now, and they're still doing that stuff, but they're also still redefining what quality is every time they meet, because it's like
awesome.
Like value, it's different to everyone. Yeah, very awesome. It's great.
Yeah. So that brings us then to this issue you mentioned a little bit earlier, that if you say what is value, then you need to look at value from different perspectives. But the starting point is personal value. Now, how do you deal with that in complex environments where there's lots of parties involved, different expectations, quite often opposing views?
Yeah. So how I deal with it, I like to bring those opposing views together. It's I think it's human nature to have opposing views. It's healthy even to do so. If we all agreed on everything, then I'm not sure we'd get anywhere. So through that, I mean, I mentioned that community. What I like to do, and I learnt it with the team I work with there, and through other approaches, is build a community where we actually look for people that have influence. So that isn't necessarily based on hierarchical position in the organization. It's based on how loud their voice is, how strong their dissent to the their feeling against something is, strong is for it, and the impact. And that's people that own processes, own technologies, who can stop us in our tracks if we don't work with them to create value and get them on side. When you bring those opposing voices together, there's an element of managing the conversation, but often you'll find that people aren't so far apart as they thought they were. They're just looking at their part of the organization or their technology or their process, and they are naturally protecting it or attempting to protect it. There's no ill intent there. There's nobody's setting out to do harm. In their way, they're trying to add value. And once people understand one another and can work with one another outside of those pressurized situations, as a community, or as a practice, however you term to reference it, you can actually achieve some really good results. And that's something I've carried through now for the last few years, building different communities, different practices, and bringing opposing views together and exploring where we've actually got some common ground, and then using that to then drive action that improves the service holistically, to use a very consultancy term.
So it's sort of full circle, because we back to Allo.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I used to read 7 Habits every year, but now I've got a subscription to Audible, so I listen to the book at least once a year. But one of the important things that I keep on reminding myself of is to listen to understand instead of to answer. And I think that's one of the valuable lessons I've learned, engaging so deeply in this issue of innovation, is that if we mix the problem and the solution space, that's when that happens. If we keep them separate, then we're willing to listen to what the problem may be.
Yes.
Without thinking about but I want the solution to be this.
Yeah. And I've not read that, and I should, because I'm similar in I think in what you're saying, in that I've not always. So in the service desk, I was very much asking and listening and so on. I've not always been that way in everything else. So in terms of working in service management, it's much more difficult to do that, because you are in those situations. And I think experience, time, and working in the industry for so long has taught me to be more and more like that. It's I guess you mature and you improve, or certainly you feel you improve. I'm running back into my conceited self then, but it is just a lot of what I do. Certainly is now you've really made me think about it. Is Allo. It's I know it's in the publication, but when you said you were going to come up with that, I was like, that's a really good point. It is in there, and what I mean by that is it's not something I consciously think about. I consciously wrote it, right, because it's a point to make in writing, but I don't sit there and consciously think it. It's just something that has developed, I guess, as I've matured.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So when will we see this much awaited book?
Well, I can give you the exclusive on that. So it's going to be next Wednesday, December the 1st. It comes out.
Okay, brilliant, awesome.
Yeah.
So everybody, look out, December the 1st. The full title of the book is?
Snappy one: Co-creating value in organizations using ITIL 4.
Okay, and it would be available from?
So I'm still to get the link, but I think it'll be the TSO store and Axelos themselves at first. It'll be an e-publication to start with. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So holding thumbs. I'm quite sure it's going to do well, because it's a good book. I enjoyed the read. I think there's lots of practical lessons in there, and I like practical stuff. Yeah. Normally, when I engage in terms of theory, it's just to be controversial. So I smiled a little bit earlier when you said to me, you should not engage to create conflict. But sometimes I find it fun to do that.
I think you can achieve great results if you can comes back to that impactors thing. If you can turn that conflict around into support, then that's massive.
Yeah.
And I worked in investment banking where conflict was almost an everyday scenario. But I'm now good friends with a number of those ex-customers of mine, and that conflict helped an awful lot when it was healthy and right to do so.
Yes. Yeah, and that normally happens when you get to the point where people realize the conversation is about an issue, it's not about a person. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So any final thoughts that you want to leave our audience with in terms of things? Let's say, what are 5 practical things that people listening to this need to go and do to make sure that there's positive engagement from both parties and co-creation.
Wow, that puts me on the spot, doesn't it? But
Yeah,
I think I can get
dropped you in the deep end there, hey?
You did. But I can give for them, because you absolutely started on that point, and I think they are so true, and that is Allo. It's the asking. So work with your customers to ask them what they need from your services. Listen to what they tell you. Observe their reactions, their behaviors, their patterns of business activity, and then empathize with that when you're delivering the services. And I think that the last one, because there's 4, if I go for the 5th one, continually do that. Don't just make it a point in time.
Yeah. Awesome. And that observing bit is something that IT people, I think, are very bad at. Very few of us has actually been where the services are used. And you can't really empathize with somebody if you don't understand the environment in which they operate or need to operate, the pressure that they're under. So make some time for everybody in the team to go and visit customers. Yeah. To go and sit where a user is busy capturing data, or a truck driver cannot get a connection and therefore can't dispatch goods. I think that helps a lot if we can just, and that's also a concept that in terms of lean management, this issue of go see, ask why and show respect.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think everybody needs to go to Gemba.
Absolutely. I think the example that I recall most from my time working at IBM, which is where I found my first mentor, was a very senior person that would come down to the desk and understand what was going on, see and hear the noise. And their feeling was, if it wasn't noisy, then it couldn't be too bad. And they were kind of right. And they were the first person that I kind of hooked onto the coattails and was like, right, I need to understand more about what you do. And I think that comes back to me seeing the value in somebody I considered to be a senior figure, paying some attention to what I was doing, because at the time I considered myself a junior figure. And I think you not only can you get closer to your customers, you can also inspire the people that work for or around you by doing that too. And that's an incredible thing.
I think you were very fortunate also to start your journey there. What most people don't know is actually much of what is in service management today comes from IBM. Those red books were terrible things to read, but good things to read. I don't know if you ever slaved through red books.
I was taught to write processes at IBM, so I didn't go for those books, but I can imagine, based on the teachings that I was given, that they were involved, I should imagine.
Yeah. So awesome, David. Also, thank you very much for your input in my latest initiative. In attempting to help industrial age organizations transform, become digital citizens by doing innovative stuff. So I absolutely value your input, and you know that I respect you as a professional. But once again, thank you. We're looking forward to seeing your book next Wednesday. And for those of you who are listening and don't know yet, this is not Wednesday. It is available now. Go to Amazon.
And it's well worth going to Amazon for, having had the having been privileged to read, understand, and be asked for feedback. Which, by the way, thank you. I'm honoured to have been asked for that. It's incredibly useful, and the way you're able to make these things make sense and seem like just simple common sense when they're not. They're very complicated, I think is amazing, and the book's really worth getting involved in.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate that, and good luck for your book. thanks for making time available, and we'll definitely see you next year again. Can you believe it? The year is nearly finished. I'm going to end the broadcast. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.